Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is ArtNet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the ArtNet Pro editorial team.
I think I felt the weight of wanting to have the art world understand where I was coming from, these native specific references.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. As anyone who has been listening to this show recently will already know, the world's largest and most closely scrutinized art event, the Venice Biennale, is now open in Italy. Every 2 years, different countries compete for the attention of art lovers and judges with national pavilions. For the 2024 Biennale, among the most talked about is that of the United States, which chose Jeffrey Gibson. Gibson is one of the most visible artists currently working, and also, with his Cherokee and Choctaw heritage, the first Native American to represent the U.S. in Venice. Representing your country at the Biennale is among the highest honors that any artist might receive, and also among the most fraught. Even from this show's title, which is The Space in Which to Place Me, you can tell that Gibson is pondering what national representation means. Gibson has transformed the U.S. pavilion's brick exterior with prismatic murals. Inside, you find a spectacle that is clearly the work of vast amounts of team labor. There are 10-foot-high figures with ceramic faces draped in beads, ribbons, and fringe, sculptures of large birds and human busts meticulously decked out in detailed rainbow beadwork, vibrant paintings that incorporate artifacts by unknown indigenous makers sourced from estate and garage sales. A bright red central chamber contains one of the types of work that has become Jeffrey Gibson's signature, a punching bag that he has transformed via beadwork into a hanging sculpture. This one featuring the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Whether that line refers to the truths of the Declaration of Independence that it is citing, or to the truths of the other art that surrounds it, you have to decide for yourself. Gibson's pavilion climaxes with a 9-screen video installation featuring a dancer performing a traditional Ojibwe powwow dance to a techno beat, the images ultimately breaking apart into kaleidoscopic abstraction. In its mix of historical references and pop, and above all in its color and warmth, The Space in Which to Place Me is a fine introduction to the themes that have defined Jeffrey Gibson's career. In the lead up to the opening, I spoke with him about his long road to the Venice Biennale. So, Jeffrey Gibson, you are a very busy artist, so I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk to me.
Thank you, and I am. I can admit that to myself now.
Well, I'm glad we were going to get into it, but I wanted to start by giving people who might not know a little bit of background on your life and career. So you were born in Colorado, but I know you grew up traveling. Your father worked for the military, and so you grew up traveling to Korea and Germany. And so how did that background affect you?
I would probably say very positively. I mean, there's certainly, I think, some challenges to moving around so much in your youth. The positive side would be living among other cultures. And I think from a very young age, having to experience what it's like to be a foreigner, but then also spend enough time in a place where you find your way in.
Right.
I will always say, I think it's great for people to know what it's like to be a foreigner, because you just can't move with the same kind of confidence that you do in your home kind of local area. And I think having to rely also on what you're looking at, what you're hearing, what you're smelling, it's a very sensory kind of experience to like engage in a culture as a foreigner. And so I think for me, that really fueled imagination, curiosity. And I do distinctly remember those moments when it's like suddenly you have some understanding and you feel like you wake up in a foreign place, but you actually have some confidence how to navigate it and language and things like that. That's the positive side. I think I don't even know if I call it a negative side, but growing up I didn't really have like a building home that I remember as like, this is my home. I always felt a little nomadic. Me, my sister, and my parents were this group of four who kind of like moved around, and we carried certain things with us, certain things that established our space as home. And then, of course, returning to visit our larger families in Mississippi and Oklahoma, I think also adds another facet to all of this because it is culturally different. I get asked about that quite a bit. I wouldn't say I ever did not feel of those communities. Like I've always considered those two places home.
Right, despite the kind of nomadic growing up.
Yeah.
It's interesting because your work incorporates so much text and lyrics from music, almost like scrutinizing them. That I do associate somehow with like looking at them from the outside. You know, that experience you have when you're abroad, when you look at a storefront and you see the text and you don't know what it is yet. So it's kind of an aesthetic object for you in a different kind of way.
It was never a challenge for me to see words as an image or to be able to like take them apart into shapes and lines. Taking things apart and putting them back together, it's just the way that I've always thought. When I lived in Korea, I was 13, 14, 15. That's that age when I'm really paying attention to music. And living in Korea, in Seoul, there would be 1 hour of MTV that would happen from midnight to 1 a.m.
Right.
And so all of the American students would make sure we paid attention to that 1 hour of like what was happening. And the next day we would talk about any new music that was played. That was sort of our portal to that aspect of American culture of the time. And it was important because it exists somewhere in the export of the US. So it's real, but it gets translated to this person on the other side of the world. And you are kind of seeing it sort of half insider and half outsider.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to start there because you are representing the United States at the Venice Biennale this year. You're the first indigenous artist to do so. And I think that's a very important lens to look at your work through. But also, you've just constantly been interested in the mobility of culture, thinking about how even what indigenous culture means or some of its shapes are part of these broader flows. Like you use a lot of beads in your work. And I've read you talk about how, you know, this fact that like, well, those are actually a lot of imported beads that became part of native ornament.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for the most part, most beadwork is foreign to the tribes that were using it. Most of those beads were coming from Europe. They were coming from countries in Africa. And I think that it's sort of wanting to rewrite that history and recognize those objects from the 1700s as global objects. They are invested in what was happening around the entire world. And so the way that we've learned about those objects has been very much, I would say, even kind of suppressed under the terms of like traditional, because I think of them as these modern movements within indigenous cultures because they're not local, right? They came through and the makers of those objects decided, I am excited by this material. I am excited by these colors. I'm going to create with this. We also don't think about the makers of those objects in that way as like autonomous creative minds that were making choices. Previous to beads, you're looking at embroidery from horsehair, moose hair, natural dyes, earth paints, beads from stones and shells and clay, and also porcupine quills, birch bark. So these are the materials that beads joined. You know, I won't say replaced because there were people who continued to work in those traditional materials, but it happens very early. And so I think when I refer to modernism, I think people think that I'm referring to the Western canon, big M modernism. But I'm actually talking about modernity, which happens at different stages in many different cultures in different circumstances. And I would say for me, that's how I think about beadwork.
Right. Well, if you're talking about modernity as the impact of, you know, having your culture uprooted by modern technology, I mean, certainly colonialism is like extremely early and disruptive and terrifying version of that.
Yeah.
In terms of art touchstones, what are some of the first art references that became important to you?
You know, my dad and my mom were both always really supportive. I was drawing since I was a child. And I think when we lived in Germany, I was very young. So I was probably, 3 or 4 when we moved over there. And then we were there for 5 years. So lots of museums, lots of exposure to music, classical music. And my dad traveled a lot. And when he would go away, he oftentimes would bring me a poster from an art museum, I suppose, because it was always a poster of a painting. I guess maybe I responded very much to Henri Matisse, very young. So I had a lot of Matisse posters in my room growing up.
That vibrant color, I guess I can really see that.
I remember having one that I actually thought was like a big poster. It was probably like 3 feet wide or something. And I thought it was a big poster. And then I saw the Matisse cutouts in DC when I was a teenager. And I had no idea that like one shape was like much bigger than the poster that I had on my wall. And it really was a very kind of like physical feeling to see it. You know, I've talked for a lot of reasons about why I think, but I think my youth, my teenage youth, you know, there was lots of magazine culture around about like youth culture, right? So music, but I think I don't want to give MTV so much credit, but I suppose, you know, they were producing all those shows. Keith Haring was doing commercials. And I think I knew about New York City, 1980s art, music, punk, DIY culture through the lens of MTV.
Interesting.
So I knew about Basquiat, I knew about Keith Haring, Andy Warhol, of course. And I think I somehow connected in a way that it's like, that's where I need to be. I need to be amongst these people because it's where I felt I would make sense. It's sort of like, that looks like the space where I will be accepted.
And to this day, your artwork does use a lot of musical references.
Oh, yeah.
These glue references that hold together people, that you kind of like reframe them, put them in the artwork as text.
And I think part of it is like, when I lived in Korea, you know, at 13, I started going to nightclubs. So that was my entry into nightclub life. And I would go, I mean, it wasn't infrequent, you know, because you could. And when I returned to the US, I was turning 16 and I started going to one particular gay club in Washington, DC called Trax. Trax was like 30,000 square feet of multiple dance floors. And it was dance music, it was pop music, it was techno, and then eventually heading into like house. You know, for me, the idea of music being like a soundtrack, it's also tied up into cinema, right? And sort of like all of those John Hughes films and like the soundtracks to like those films and how the soundtracks really were very much a part of the narrative. For me, at least, that was the generation, how I would describe my relationship to music. You know, my dad, I remember when I was really young, he would play Prince a lot. He also played Rod Stewart, a lot of Stevie Nicks, a lot of Fleetwood Mac. And my mom, I remember this distinctly, on Sunday mornings and Saturday mornings, she would be making breakfast and she would always listen to 60s Motown. That was like the soundtrack of like weekend breakfasts.
One way to think about one aspect of your artwork is through the politics of joy. You know, It is art that attains to the condition of its beauty, the fact that it draws you in, kind of brings together people around it as an aesthetic. So you end up going to New York, but before that, there's quite a bit before that, actually. You go to Chicago to get your Bachelor of Fine Arts. You graduated in 1995. And I wanted to ask you about your time working for the Field Museum while you were in school there, just because you were research assistants on the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And that's such a contemporary issue, I guess. I mean, just this week, the Smithsonian, I think, had a new commission said it needs to speed up the return of human remains to the tribes that they were taken from. So how did that time spent there, I think you were 3 years at the Field Museum on this, affect the way you thought about museums and art?
I mean, it's pretty radical how much it affected me. I think once I started, probably in my late 30s, started looking at that time and really kind of unpacking it, I realized how impactful it was. And I think language, just to return to language, you know, even when I talk musical lyrics, I throw it into the group of language, right? So for instance, I'll give an example. My job was we would get notice from a tribe saying, we understand there are holdings within the Field Museum that we'd like to come and visit. My job was to go into the database and pull all of the records for anything we had affiliated with that tribe. Then the tribe would ultimately make a visit to the museum. And my job was to assist in pulling all of the objects and putting them into rooms for the tribal delegations to view. Now, this seems, I think, relatively simple enough. But in fact, oftentimes what it revealed was the inaccuracy of the records, which comes from lots of different reasons. It also revealed the inaccurate descriptions of what certain objects were. When it comes to objects like ceremonial objects, sacred objects, oftentimes when those objects were collected, if they were, let's say, collected from a site of war and they were stolen, we don't really have accurate records as to what they are. A lot of this, even if you spoke to somebody, a native person who knew what it was, if it's a ceremonial object, there are many things that are not meant to be talked about, that are not meant to be shared. So we may not know exactly what certain things were. There are many things that many people were never meant to witness, never meant to see, never meant to be in the same room with. And so the big shift for me during that time was for what had been described to me as inanimate objects, right? Let's say like a pot or a basket, to suddenly shift over time, not just within those 3 years, but even after, to seeing that object as an ancestor, to seeing that object as alive, and seeing that object as being a living entity that is stored in a dark place without any contact or engagement. It has no context of what it was meant and made to be used for. The reason why they're so important is because they enable the culture to survive and to grow and to continue. Even their use, the wear and tear of it, indicates another one will be made, right? And so the narratives of the designs, of the paintings, of the quill work, all of those things are lost. And that was like the kind of unpacking. And to realize those two different perspectives, to see an object as inanimate versus seeing an object as a relative, they're so radically different. And so for a while, my thinking kind of existed between this spectrum. I got to a point where I was like, I can't deny that all objects have a life. Not just those objects in museums, but even our contemporary objects that we're among today have narratives and have lives. And that's, I think, where it really has impacted how I think about making work today.
Yeah, and I guess that loops back to kind of the role of music and these experiences of dance and just seeing living culture, being present with living culture and feeling it as an important agent of moving through the world. After you got your BFA in Chicago, and then you went to London, actually, to study painting at the Royal College of Art. And I know that graduate work was sponsored by the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, which must have been a great honor, but also, to a certain extent, must have felt like some kind of pressure on you, right?
I'm trying to remember. I mean, I guess it did feel like pressure, because it's not anything they had ever done before. And Chief Philip Martin, who was our tribal chief at the time, also served as like a real mentor and advisor for me. There was another woman who managed the educational scholarships named Nan Stamper, who really was incredible because what I was doing wasn't something that they really understood, But I will say that Chief Martin always reminded me that what I was doing was what he had spoken about in terms of the future of Choctaw people. That we would, through our own self-determination, go out into the world and we would have impact. And I think the idea of me existing outside of and beyond the reservation and the home communities is something that he celebrated. And I think if he didn't celebrate it, I don't know if I would have had the wherewithal to have the confidence that what I was doing was very much connected to the vision of our tribal chief. And it's not that he necessarily understood art in the way that I was pursuing it, but he had always supported traditional makers there in Mississippi. Has a huge collection. And I would bring an artwork to him every now and again, and he would kind of, put it in the room with the other artworks that he had collected. He would ask me a couple of questions about like, what was it? But yeah, I think that kind of unconditional support that he offered is so rare, and I think so unexpected. I really had no expectation that they would have supported me in such a big way.
So had you found your signature style then? What was the kind of work you were making at that time?
I think in a way, yeah. I mean, I tell a lot of artists this now, young artists, sometimes it's almost like you're like stuttering in the beginning of pursuing what you want to make because you don't really have all the words, you don't really have all the skill, but the seed of what I'm doing now, I can clearly see linked to what I was doing then. And it's kind of funny because now I look at what I'm doing, and I'm talking about literally like what's happening in the studio right now. I'm looking at what I'm doing and it takes me back to my 20s in Chicago. Even language. The first piece that I made when I went to London was about a rat. And I remember I did a print and I was using the word rat. And I remember, I think that, I guess to describe it sort of like, it's not spectacular, right? The word rat is not a spectacular word. The image of a rat is not spectacular. And I think like
pretty
right
much
now,
the definition of a common word. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think right now I'm looking at the language that I'm writing. I'm doing a lot of writing now. And it is about trying to find the phenomena in the everyday, just the sort of things that are really right in front of us and trying to be able to describe them. So even that, I think it's always been there. I think the difference is then I thought that text kind of locked you in. I didn't realize how slippery words could be. I didn't realize how poetic they could be, how abstract they could be. And I think that's the skill that I've learned working with language all these years.
How did you end up in New York?
Well, I met my partner, Bruni Olson, who's also an artist, in London in 1998.
So right when you graduated?
Just before, yeah. I stayed in London for an additional year, and we actually got married in Norway, where same-sex partnerships became legal in 1997. And we got married in 1999. And then we moved to New York together in the fall of 1999. I think we had like $1,200 between the two of us. And we had some friends who were living in Washington Heights. They gave us their apartment for a week. And then we subletted a place in the East Village. I think for what we were doing, being two artists, I just thought, you know what? New York City is going to be where we're going to have the best chance of this happening. And luckily, Rooney agreed. And so we moved to New York City. And then just like every other artist who moves to New York with some sort of dream, you battle it out. And hopefully it pays off.
About 5 years ago, I did just a sort of a personal study where I looked at all kinds of museums across the country to see who was showing the most. And I came to the conclusion, putting it all in a spreadsheet, that the two artists who were being shown most at that time were you and Simone Leigh. And now Simone Leigh did the last Venice Biennale pavilion and you're doing this one. But it really hasn't always been like that. I mean, both of you are artists who's had like pretty big breaks later. And I know that there's a moment in 2010 when you've talked about the fact that you were thinking about giving it all up.
Yeah.
So what was that crisis and what brought you out of it?
The art world, as many other worlds are, is not fair. It is inequitable. My experience of it was it triggered a tremendous amount of anxiety within me. I think I felt the weight of wanting to have the art world understand where I was coming from, these native specific references. I think it caused me tremendous pain to see how many native artists have been ignored, not just as individuals, but collectively, historically. In my mind, I perceived I was carrying that weight with me. That was what I was trying to do, trying to get people to understand, why it was important to do this. And at some point, I had to realize that the art world is not necessarily a philanthropic place.
No,
its goal is not always social progress. And I know those words get tossed around a lot in the art world and how we talk about artists, but there's so many other parts to it. So there's some of that too. There are people who are pushing that, but there's so many other parts to it. And I think it felt so unfair. And I just thought, I don't know if I have what it takes to stick it out. Those were the moments of wanting to walk away.
It wasn't a creative crisis so much as it really just is anybody listening?
Yeah. I mean, I was working at the time, sometimes 8 to 9 jobs a week. I was freelancing as an educator. I was adjuncting. I was doing curriculum development. I was working, on average, I would say about 70 hours a week, and then still trying to go home and make a painting and still being broke all the time. It just, nothing about it felt fair. The feeling was always like, how much longer could I do this?
Is there a moment that you consider your breakthrough or when things changed?
I think when I received a Creative Capital grant in 2005, I would say it felt like a big win. A friend of mine, Tana Harjest, wonderful artist, received the grant, I believe, in 2002. And I just saw what it was able to do for her. And I thought, you know what? This is what I need. I need a chunk of money. I need time and the kind of support that Creative Capital offers artists. So I worked on that application, and it's not an easy application. To this day, it's still not. It goes through lots of different peer reviews. But I knew when I sent it off that I had written the best application that I could possibly do. So I was like, if I get it, great. And if I don't get it, I've figured a lot out in this process, you know? And then I got it. And I would say that that felt, at least in the moment, like a really, really big break. And ultimately, I would say it opened a lot of doors. It introduced me to a lot of people very quickly.
And then it's around 2010, though, when in this kind of crossroads moment, you also start making your punching bag works,
yes,
which are, I think, have become a real signature for you.
You know, so even though I got the Creative Capital grant in 2005, I guess what I was referring to about, you know, it seemed like a really big break was all of my expectations of like what was going to happen after getting a Creative Capital grant didn't happen, right? And so I felt like I was not quite right back to where I was, but the feeling of like, oh my gosh, like what do I have to do to get this going was still there. And so the punching bag came about after going to therapy. And I had a really great therapist. And he and I would talk about, of course, you know, my childhood, growing up, but ultimately this idea that the art world was still so triggering for me. You know, I could feel the racism, I could feel the homophobia, I could feel the classism. And I felt like it was still like a club that I just couldn't get in. And he was saying to me, you know, he said, well, what's happening in your mind and what's happening in your body are not speaking to each other. And you need to find a way to bring these two in conversation together. So he recommended I work with a personal trainer. And I had this incredible trainer who introduced me to boxing. And she would hold the punching bag and she would ask me, you know, who do you want to hit? Who do you want to kick? Who are you angry at? And I realized that there was no face, right? It was just a societal condition. It's faceless in many ways. At the same time, I had done some traveling and met with very traditional makers from different tribes. And I realized that they were really empowering themselves through what they were making. And there was something that happened one day where it just occurred to me. There was people who I met who were making their own clothes, making their own jewelry, making their own music. And there was something about them wearing what they made that just sort of disempowered violence. Like it commanded respect, it commanded honor. And there was something about that bag that I thought, if I dress it, I wouldn't want to hit it. It just sort of merged one day. And I had the vision to make the first bag.
And now you work in upstate New York, or you live and work in upstate New York,
yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And your studio consists of anywhere between 14 and 17 people, something like that.
Correct.
I've heard descriptions of it. It's this old schoolhouse. And I was wondering if you could tell me about the process of making your works now, which I understand is quite an operation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. Over the years, you know, we moved up here in 2012. So we've been up here for 12 years now. And so I always talk about this iteration of the studio. And it's been growing over those years. And I just did a job review for one of my employees yesterday who's been here for 10 years. And we were talking about how much it's changed. Part of me moving up here was I wanted to start a family. And I knew that I didn't want to be an absent parent. And so I wanted to build a team that would enable me to be able to have a personal life and to have a family home life. I remember when I would interview people, I would tell them that's why I'm building this team. What's happened over the years is we have really committed people who are all makers and artists of their own individual selves. This person that I spoke to yesterday, named Amanda, has a studio memory now that we can talk about something we did 5 or 6 years ago. We can talk about the problems that we had and what we could do now. Right now, it's wild. This team is so smart and so talented that I can go in, we can sit down and have a meeting, we can experiment, we can produce, we can make things that we've made in the past pretty easily. I spend most of my time doing drawings, doing renderings, and working on parts of the artworks that I feel are most important for me to do physically. Since 2011, I have never had my own private studio space. I've been working amongst this group of people. And just 2 weeks ago, I established a space which is private and mine. That's wild to me. It never occurred to me all these years.
It's wild to me.
Yeah, it's crazy. And everyone who works here, I have so much trust in. It's a very special place.
So there are people working on paintings in one space and sculptures in another, and people kind of specialize in different parts of the process?
Yeah. I mean, the beadwork, we've tried outsourcing beadwork, and I haven't been very happy with it. So the beadwork happens here. All of the textile stuff happens here. All the painting happens here. We work sometimes with fabricators. We even have someone on staff who like welds, so builds the armatures on site. Yeah, it all happens in here. I mean, the school is perfect because it has 10 classrooms and they're kind of scaled perfectly. We have like a sewing room, we have a beading room, the gym is the painting studio, we have a clay room now, we have a kiln finally, and then there's a second space where it's a much larger painting space, and that's where my studio is, my private studio.
So now you've got this big show, probably one of the biggest kinds of shows that you could possibly have coming up in Venice. How does something like that come together? How does a Venice Biennale pavilion show happen?
I'd like to think that it happens differently for every artist who's done it. For me, so Kathleen Ash Milby, I met when she was the director and curator at the American Indian Community House in New York City. And we met in 2002. She was, in fact, my very first New York City studio visit.
Wow.
Yeah, wild. She came in, and I remember we looked at my work, and she was just intrigued. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is someone who gets me, who wants to support me. We did a show in 2005 at the community house. And then she moved on to the National Museum of the American Indian, to the Gustav High Center in Lower Manhattan. And she included my work from my Creative Capital grant in 2007. So we've known each other this whole entire time. And we've talked about our hopes and dreams for Native artists, not just in New York City, but beyond. So I always knew if I ever did anything like this, I would want her on board. And then Abigail Winograd, the second curator, co-curator, we worked on an exhibition over the, must have been about 2 years ago at the Newberry Library in Chicago. I really enjoyed working with her. She's really smart. We think very similarly. So she was in Venice in the summer of 2022, called me up from Venice and said, "Why aren't you here?" And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Why aren't you here?" I said, "Well, people had approached me before and it just never felt like the timing was right." And I said, "If you wanted to talk to me about it," I said, "I would talk to you." So she came back. Now, she's an independent curator. So I immediately said, well, I would want Kathleen to come on board. And also because for me, I really need those two brains. I need somebody who understands the history of modern and contemporary art. And I need somebody who understands modern and contemporary Native art, but also relationships with Native communities and what's necessary with that. So Louis Grouchos, director of Cite Santa Fe, we'd done a show together. They commissioned a video together. I just had done the big exhibition at Cite, The Body Electric. And he had just kind of thrown out one day, he was like, when you're ready, we should talk about proposing you for Venice. And so I thought, this is my dream team, Louis, Kathleen, and Abigail. So I called them up, and it was Indian Market of 2023. We all met at Cite Santa Fe.
One of the biggest art fairs in the country.
It was at that meeting that we all agreed, let's do this. Kathleen had moved on to the Portland Art Museum at that time. And I think by that point, she had already gotten the permission from the museum to go ahead and take this on if we all agreed. And then it was kind of amazing. Portland Art Museum extended their development department, their grants writer, to us. They would come here to New York. We would meet at the studio. We spent like 2 or 3 days just sort of like walking through like ideas, questions. What is Jeff thinking? I had a plan, and I went to Venice. I saw Simone's installation. And I realized that my initial proposal was not going to work. It's not the right space. It's not the right context. So I came back and I totally pivoted and I established a kind of working checklist of what I envisioned in the pavilion. And then my studio team, we started making in January of 2023. And this is before the proposal. This is before we know if we're getting it. And I just know how long things take in my studio. And I thought, if we don't do this, there's no chance I will be able to make what I want to make.
Wow. So you started on this pavilion before we knew. Any idea that you could actually do it?
No, not at all. Yeah, exactly. We started before we knew anything. The proposal itself doesn't get submitted until April. So by the time it was submitted in late April, I just thought, you know what? If we get it, great. If we don't get it, we'll find other places to show these works. And it had honestly been so much work up to that point that I was kind of thinking, I was like, wow, it might be a little bit of a relief if we don't get it. Like just realizing how big this was, what I was planning. So you said it in April. I believe we heard towards the end of July. And then it's just like a marathon. You just pick it up and you run. It's kind of nuts. And then everything shipped off. February 1st, everything left.
We're recording this a little bit before Venice. It will come out a little bit after the show has opened. Give people a sense of what they see in the pavilion.
Well, we start with the exterior of the building. Simone's exterior of the building was so spectacular. And I think really shifted just walking up to the American Pavilion. It starts from like hundreds of feet away. It actually starts from an image, right? If you see an image of it. So I think when you look at, in particular, the American pavilions over the past few iterations, that front facade becomes very much a very important exhibition space. So there's a large public interactive sculpture, which sits in the forecourt. And then there are hand-painted murals, which are affixed to the surfaces of the building itself. Lots of color. There are flags that are suspended from teepee poles off of the front of the building. And then this sculpture, which is a bright, solid red, is a conglomeration of historical monument pedestals. And so the public is invited to climb onto that, to perform on it, to really do what they want on it. But we are also programming it with different kinds of performances during the run of the exhibition. Then when you go inside, there's sculptures, lots of beadwork, paintings, there's works on paper. And those works on paper incorporate 20th century found, or I've acquired, but found beadwork made by unnamed makers. And then there's a video at the end.
And it's called The Space in Which to Place Me. Where does that title come from?
The title, The Space in Which to Place Me, comes from a poem titled Hisepa by Layli Long Soldier, who's a Lakota poet whose work I have been reading for probably about 5 years. Incredible poet. And I was so nervous when I wrote to her to ask her permission to use the words, and so thrilled when she agreed. She's a force, for sure.
So it's a big deal. I mean, this is a very visible space. Do you have reflections on what it means to represent the United States, particularly as an indigenous artist?
I mean, I'm going to go back to my childhood. You know, you're asking me about moving around so much. I think I'm drawing a lot on the humility of being a foreigner. There's something about that kind of humility of like moving slow without certain expectations that I'm entering into this with. I'm there to represent myself. Of course, I understand a byproduct of that is representing the US as an indigenous person. I have tried to bring the best of what I do. I've tried to bring as much collaboration and representation of the spectrum of indigenous voices that I can. I have long ago kind of let go of my expectations of an audience's reaction. And I think in particular with the world that we live in right now, there's so much that I can't control, right? And I think that the language that I've chosen to use throughout the artworks in the pavilion, originally I was looking at the founding documents of the US, and eventually that leads into individuals, it leads into amendments, it leads into music, leads into quotes and speeches. And I've been looking at sort of the history of the US as having these moments of progressive proposals. We've always had proponents of equity. We've always had proponents of people advocating for justice and equity and inclusion. And I've made the decision to use that language as a way of kind of hopefully triggering, like, why haven't these things happened? Because we're all involved in that. Why hasn't it happened?
Right.
Also, one of the things about moving around, I've said this before, you learn how to ignore your feelings sometimes, because moving around so much as a child, I think, could be traumatic. I don't remember it that way, but I do remember sort of not remembering the things that I didn't like, or not remembering the things that caused me pain and loneliness. I think I'm also leaning into that a bit. I can kind of just sort of go into a zone of like, I'm an artist. This is what I've made. It's still an experiment. You put it out into the world and you stand by it.
And I know the Pavilion is also organizing this Venice Indigenous Art School in June. I'm really interested in that. Are you involved in that? The project is this Keywords in Indigenous Arts project. So what is that? What is the importance of that? I think that extends some of what you were just saying.
Well, my relationship to the Institute of American Indian Arts is I almost went there when I was young. Ultimately, I decided to go to the Art Institute of Chicago. But I think IAIA is one of the most important institutions because there's no comparable institution that exists. And it was started by artists who had a real progressive vision of what Indigenous artists should have available to them, the kind of support they should have, creative support in particular, and really with a goal for it to go out into the world. So for me, when we were talking about who our educational partners were, IAIA has always been the clear front runner for me. And so Mario Caro established the MFA program there. They always do a summer session, and I believe they oftentimes do go to the Biennale at some point. So we reached out to them, and this is something that they had already begun. So our invitation has collaborated a bit in terms of like me suggesting content, me being available, me wanting to engage with the students. But ultimately, really, I would say this is totally their creation. What I think is interesting about the keywords in Indigenous art, they're looking at language from an Indigenous perspective in terms of like, how do we talk about art made by Native people? How do we talk about topics that come up within artworks made by Indigenous artists? And I think part of it is like Native languages are oftentimes more descriptive. So for instance, when you're talking about time, there are many different kinds of time. Just to say the word time, you have to talk about, is it the time before? Is it the time now? Is it the time when it rains? Is it the time when it's dark? Is it the time when the sun comes up? So I think oftentimes when we're talking about artwork by Native artists, we're still describing it through the lens of like the way that the West and Europe has described art. And it's just an attempt to shift that perspective and to place Indigenous perspectives and voices both as the maker and the person writing about them. And so it still can kind of exist as an experiment, but I think it's a really important one. It will be documented. It will show up in the catalog. And we have a lot of educational programming where the goal is to get this information out into the world.
So last year, you edited a book called An Indigenous Present.
Yes.
And I just wanted to end there with a question about that term, like what that means for you. It seems like a really important intellectual project for you and maybe something that might resound with this pavilion.
Yeah, I mean, an Indigenous present, I think my early years in New York City, living in Manhattan and then Brooklyn, this craving for a community of other Native artists who I think know that we belong everywhere in the world. We belong not just within our communities, but it's important that we exist in the world. That was the desire. We're looking at 20 plus years. Over those 20 years, I've seen it go from academic symposiums to eventually there being Native curators, Native scholars, Native programs within universities and colleges, to Native artists beginning to establish their own kind of modes of working. And I'm talking about both between the US and Canada. So really North America. And so I feel like I have never seen this much happening before in my lifetime with indigenous artists. And I thought, we need a snapshot. We need a document that can live past this moment because it's clearly going to continue changing. I don't know what that change is going to be, but we need a snapshot of this moment. So an indigenous present, that's really where it comes from. And my co-editor, Janelle Porter, and I have known each other since 2013. She organized my first solo museum exhibition at the ICA in Boston. And she and her husband have made books for over 20 years. So she was a huge, huge help in realizing the book.
Well, Jeffrey Gibson, you're a very busy person, and I'm very grateful for you to have taken so much time to talk to me. I can't wait to see the pavilion. I can't wait to hear about all the discussions that come out of it. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to The Art Angle on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review our show. It will help listeners discover what we are doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.